Accreditation standards, the current version that's in place, came into force at the beginning of 2016. This is an opportunity a few years later to review their standards, to see how they've gone, how they've been received by our stakeholders, and see what might be improved in those standards.
It's appropriate that we go back and revisit to determine whether they are still fit for purpose. Is there some tweaks that we could make to them, having had them operationalised for 3 years? Did we get it right the first time? There's all sorts of changes that come there, but also the environment changes, and we need to look at that.
So at the beginning of the review, we set out a few areas that we particularly wanted to focus on. Not areas where we may necessarily make any changes, but areas we wanted to consider whether changes were required. We want to look at the criterion we have for interprofessional education, see how that's working, see whether our expectations of education providers are high enough in that area. Another area for us is consumer involvement. So the standards at the moment don't mention the dental consumer, but uses the services of a dental student once they've qualified and been registered in their chosen profession. So we want to consider whether the standards should. And then finally, the biggest area perhaps that we want to look at is cultural safety. So often called cultural competence in New Zealand. In Australia, cultural safety is a big focus in the National Registration and Accreditation Scheme. And we've committed to a statement of intent, which commits to our role as an accreditation authority through our standards and guidelines in creating a culturally safe workforce to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we want to think about whether the existing standard that we have in the accreditation standards is sufficient, and if it's not, how can we build on that standard to create clearer and higher level requirements of education providers in this area.
So in a New Zealand context, we've had a recent change to the legislation, and that requires us to look at cultural competence and interprofessional learning. So it's very timely because we can look at the accreditation standards from both of those perspectives and look to see what changes we might need in them to meet our requirements that came into being in April 2019.
So the role of the Working Party is really to provide external advice and expert advice for the review.
We've got representation for Maori and for the Indigenous people through Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We've got representation from an accrediting body outside of health, so that we can look to see if we can learn from the way another profession utilises accreditation. We've got academics that bring the knowledge of how they develop a program, how they develop a curriculum, how they assess, and all the things that we are going to be looking at. And then we've got professional practitioners that are in business at the table as well for contemporary practice.
We're not there to do all of the crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's, but to provide the expert advice.
So what we want to do really is to test our ideas with an expert group who can then help us shape recommendations and proposals which we'll put out for public consultation next year.